Thank you, Rutger Bregman. Welcome to Bangalore Literature Festival. We're here to talk about Humankind, a hopeful
Yes.
history. And I'm not going to belabor the introduction too much. I mean, you all know about Rutger, and I want to anyway talk mostly about the book, not sort of all about you. That we can say that for another time. But I wanted to start because I think a lot of people in India and elsewhere would have read your previous book, Utopia for Realists, before reading Humankind. So, and I've just got my copy of Utopia for Realists here, and it opens like this. Let's start with a little history lesson. In the past, everything was worse. You go on about that to prove your case very convincingly. In Humankind, one of the arguments of the book is that for a lot of the past, things were pretty good. Inequality between men and women was low. Society in general was much more equal. So are these stories both true?
I think so, yes. It's all about how you define history. So if we look at the last 10,000 years, which is the history of what we call civilization, then indeed everything used to be worse. Life was pretty bad for most people most of the time. Up until the year 1800, extreme poverty was around 90%. Child mortality was very high. There were a huge amount of infectious diseases, and we didn't have vaccines back then. We didn't have antibiotics. Life was horrible. Also, there were a lot of moral catastrophes going on. Think about slavery, for example. Up until the year 1800, around 3/4 of the world population was some kind of slave to someone else, at least owned by some kind of rich guy, almost always guys, obviously. We had, hierarchy, the patriarchy, wars. Just sometimes if you study history, you get the feeling that history is just war, war, war. And if there's not a war, then we call it the interbellum, the period in between wars. So that's the point I tried to get across in my first book, Utopia for Realists, is that we have made incredible progress in the last, I would say, 150 years, and especially the last 50 years since the end of the Second World War. Every single day, more than 100,000 people are pulled out of extreme poverty. And I mean, there's still so much to do, but I think it's important to recognize that progress. But if you zoom out a little bit further and you don't just look at the last 10,000 years, but you look at, our whole history as a species, that lasts for around 300,000 years, then the shape of history starts to look very different. Because for 95% of our history, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. It's like the first 290,000 years. And life as a nomadic hunter-gatherer wasn't all that bad. And I guess I didn't fully realize that when I was writing Utopia for Realists. And I really try to get that point across in Humankind, is that, this view that is sometimes associated with the French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the notion that in the state of nature, we live lives that were actually pretty good, pretty egalitarian, relatively healthy, etc. If you look at the latest evidence we have from anthropology and archaeology, it seems to be the case that this crazy Frenchman, Rousseau, who's so often been dismissed as the naive, revolutionary romantic, well, actually seems to be pretty correct, on 80 or 90% of the issues. So then the shape of history starts to look very different, right? Usually when we talk about it in school, it's often described as a march of progress, right? Things steadily getting better. In Utopia for Realists, I say, well, actually it was very, very bad. And then it became very much better very quickly. But if we zoom out even further, what we see is that life for 95% of our history was, relatively good, at least not all that bad. Then it deteriorated completely, in the era of civilization. And then, in the last 200 years, it became so much better for so many people. So, it's very strange and very different from what they told us in school.
Yeah. I want to come back to Rousseau. All I'll say about that now is that I hope you haven't offended too many Swiss people by calling him French.
Yeah, sorry. Well, he wrote in French, at least.
He did write in French. That is true.
Yes.
No, so, but on this difference, a lot of the ways in which it was bad up until 1800 or up until today it was also bad in the hunter-gatherer period. If you talk about, they didn't have vaccines, low life expectancy, so on and so forth. I mean, you're really talking more about social structure, how people were, what it was like, what interpersonal relationships were like, right? I mean, patriarchy, dominance, inequality, those kinds of things.
Yes. Absolutely. But there are some other things, like, for example, hunter-gatherers obviously didn't have access to vaccines, but infection diseases were probably much less of a problem than they are in civilized societies, because many infection diseases originate from contact with domesticated animals, because humans live too close to their animals and they live too close to one another. And then when we settled down, when we started living in villages and cities, and when we domesticated animals such as cows and pigs and horses, you name it, then basically our societies became petri dishes for the development of new diseases and viruses, just as is the case today, right? I mean, COVID-19 was not like a black swan, but more like a black elephant, right? People have been predicting it for a very long time, and well, here it is. And there will be many more infection diseases like that, because that is inherent to the way we've structured our society, and especially modern agriculture. So that was much less of a problem in nomadic hunter-gatherer societies. Now, I mean, we shouldn't romanticize the way people lived back then, but it is striking that actually progress, or civilization, the move towards an agriculture society was actually really, really bad for most people.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, even if we do romanticize them, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, you can some people can try and have a paleo diet, but we're not actually going to reconstruct. Most society is not going to go back to living in those ways.
Yes.
But I want to take up something you picked up, which is your approach to writing history, because I think you have a very distinctive way of writing history and approach to, I don't just mean compared to academic historians, but because, one of the things you do is you really pull in insights from all kinds of fields, like anthropology, archaeology, behavioral science, educational psychology, so on and so forth. And the subtitle of your book is very striking, The Hopeful History, because I think one of the things that you do, and I don't know if you agree, but I'll just put it to you, is that you believe that the way that we talk about the past is relevant for the present and future, and you're not apologetic about that. I mean, academic history, you're told, don't bring the present into the past. It's called presentism. But I think the way you do it, you say, no, the way that we talk about the past really matters for us now.
Yes, I commit a lot of academic sins, I must confess. So what I believe is that history is the most subversive of all the social sciences, because it shows us that things can be different. And that's obviously a very simple lesson, but I think it's a profound lesson. The fact that there's nothing inevitable about the way we've structured our society and economy right now, and it can all change. I think that is, it's liberating, and it's politically dangerous in many ways, right? So that's how I try to use history, to basically show people that things can be different. My first book, Utopia for Realists, I tried to make the point over and over again that things that we consider milestones of civilization today, it's democracy or the end of slavery or equal rights for men and women, these were all dismissed as utopian fantasies not all that long ago. It's really striking if you study the history of abolitionism, for example, is that, in the 18th century, the vast majority of people thought that there was nothing wrong with slavery. And it wasn't just the Europeans, it was actually slavery was normal in parts of India, in China, in Africa, in South America, among the Native Americans. Slavery was a really common institution, and it was actually freedom that was the exception in many societies. So if you would have argued back then that we should abolish slavery, 9 out of 10 people would have said you're crazy, and the 10th person would have said, well, I agree with you in principle, but the practical circumstances for us, we can't really do it because it will wreck the economy or something like that. And I think that's really striking, because it makes you think, what are the things we consider normal today, and that we don't do anything about, but may be seen as crimes by the historians of the future, right? And that question itself is subversive. It's a dangerous question. And I think that history has just an extraordinary ability to do that, to wake people up to injustices today. And I'm not afraid to use the power of history in that way.
Yeah, it's the old cliche that I think is still important, which is that you remember that what is now the past was once the future.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in Humankind's a book with obviously full of ideas. There is one big idea, which is that human nature is essentially decent, deep down decent. And I think you approach proving this in a couple of different ways. One is building a huge amount of evidence for why that is the case, and also refuting some very popular or well-known arguments and studies for why it might not be. And then one of these is your chapter. I think it's one of the most interesting chapters in the book about the real Lord of the Flies. So you say that when you knew you wanted to write the book, you knew people were going to bring up William Golding's novel Lord of the Flies, and you contrast this with a true story of a group of boys from Tonga. And one question I had, and I think a lot of people readers will have it, is there are many cases of this in the book where you contrast two different studies or two different stories. How do you determine what is generalizable and what isn't? I mean, what's the principle there for the generalizable inference that you can draw from a story like the real Lord of the Flies?
It's a really good question. So what I try to do in the book is, on the one hand, I try to tell good stories, because stories have the incredible power to motivate people and change people's lives. We humans, we are and we become the stories that we tell ourselves. That is exactly why I was so interested in writing a chapter about Lord of the Flies. I mean, here we have one of the most famous novels in Western culture. Tens of millions of children around the globe have been, basically forced to read it in high school. And, were pretty cynical and depressed after they turned the last page. And it's fiction, but still, it's been so powerful. I mean, if we look at, for example, British politicians today, I think so many of them have this Lord of the Flies like worldview, right? And it has real consequences in real life, in the way they practice politics. But then what I try to do on the other hand is to always connect it to the latest evidence we have from science. It's a question that I kept in my mind as I was writing this book is, will this hold up 10 years from now? It's actually a really interesting and difficult way to write a book. If we have a newspaper, for example, most people don't want to read yesterday's newspaper. Yeah. So that makes you wonder, how worthless must the information be that's in the newspaper, right? If you don't even want to read it a day later. If you ask yourself the question, will this hold up 10 years from now? What you're going to do is you're not going to rely on the latest fancy study from Science or Nature, one of the prestigious journals, but you really want to build on research traditions, on so-called meta-analyses, studies of studies, where they've collected a whole bunch of studies. Yeah. So those are the two approaches I have in the book. On the one hand, tell good stories, but then try and connect it to the best possible scientific evidence we have. Now, what's funny is that obviously the example that you talk about, the real life Lord of the Flies, is probably the weakest argument I make in the whole book, right? It's just one anecdote of something that happened, in a very different culture than Western culture, at least. Tongan culture seems to be a pretty peculiar culture. At least people learn how to swim from a very early age. They know how to survive in nature. If you would have dropped me on an island when I was 15 years old, I don't think I would have survived with my highly specialized knowledge of the latest computer games, right? That probably wouldn't have helped me all that much. But then still, I thought it was relevant that people should know that it has happened one time in all of world history. Yeah. We have one case where real kids shipwrecked on a real island. And it's such a different story that I think that kids deserve to know it, right? Kids who have to read the fictional Lord of the Flies, they deserve to know that something similar to that happened once. And for whatever reasons, the outcome was the total opposite of the depressing story that we're told about in school. It's a story of survival of the friendliest, of kids cooperating and surviving because they are loyal to one another and they work together.
To what extent would you say that you are an essentialist about human nature? In other words, how important do you think cultural and social differences are? I'm thinking, for example, of your chapter about the Norwegian prison. And you outline the economic case and for doing this elsewhere. But how much of that works because Norway is a particular kind of society?
Well, it's interesting that Norway used to have very different kind of prisons. So in the 1980s, Norwegian prisons were famous for being incredibly strict, very high recidivism rate, very high chance that people who got out of prison would commit, another crime. So in that particular case, I don't think there were sort of deep cultural reasons for this approach to criminal justice or how to build a criminal justice system. People often say that in my country, the Netherlands, when they're here, they look at all the bicycles. We're famous, obviously, because there are like 2 or 3 times as many bikes in the country as there are citizens, as people. And a lot of foreigners who come here, they think, oh, it must be in Dutch culture, right? Dutch culture is so egalitarian, and that's why we prefer the bike instead of the car or whatever. But if you watch photos or videos from the 1960s, it's pretty much the opposite. It's cars everywhere. And there was a huge political battle in the 70s, and basically the people on bikes won, right? So again, history liberates you here. It shows you that things can be different. Things could be much better. They also could be much worse. We are the masters of our own destiny in the end. Obviously, we humans, it's in our nature to be cultural, right? We learn from each other all the time. We imitate one another all the time. There are some people on the far left who almost as much say that humans are blank slates, that you can basically do anything with us. And I would disagree with that. I think there is something that you could call human nature. For example, humans have a deep yearning to be part of a group, to be liked. We in that sense, we are fundamentally not selfish, or at least we can't survive on our own. We just so much need that meaning and connection. That is, I would say, something you can see in every human culture. The same as our playfulness. If you study nomadic hunter-gatherers cultures around the globe, you see extraordinary differences. So, you mentioned the Paleo Diet. But the Paleo diet could be anything, right? Some people believe that it's just eating meat, and that's probably true for the Eskimos, right? Up in the north. But there are other nomadic hunter-gatherer culture tribes that only eat vegetables all day. And it turns out that the human digestive system is hugely adaptable, right? And we can survive on all kinds of different stuff. It's only, the Western McDonald's diet that's really bad for us. Most people agree about that. But apart from that, it's pretty flexible. But then some other things. So I mentioned this playfulness. It's really striking that if you look how nomadic hunter-gatherer cultures raise their kids, there are striking commonalities around the globe. So kids get a huge amount of freedom to play, to roam around, and to learn from each other.
Yeah, I think if you, this is just a sort of a note to the audience that on this topic about playfulness, I think one of the chapters of the book that's really relevant to India is Rutger's chapter about education and how education should cultivate playfulness rather than, certain other things rather than say, conformity. So this is a book that is also, you're arguing against something in this book, and that's something called veneer theory. It's a term coined by Frans de Waal. I think many people won't be familiar with that term. So what is veneer theory, and why is it wrong?
It's a simple idea that our civilization is just a thin layer, just a thin veneer, and that below that lies raw human nature, that supposedly humans deep down are selfish, evil, or even monsters. And if you just scratch the surface a little bit, or something bad happens, say a natural disaster, a crisis, that we reveal who we really are. Now, this idea, veneer theory, it comes back again and again and again in Western history. So you can already find it among the ancient Greeks. The famous Greek historian Thucydides was a proponent of veneer theory. You can find it in Orthodox Christianity. So if you read the Church Fathers, for example, they believe that we're all sinners deep down, and that there's something called original sin. That was, still a very important idea in Christianity. then if you read the Enlightenment philosophers who were so influential in the 17th and the 18th century, I mean, I already mentioned Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but maybe even more influential was Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, who is seen as one of the most important political philosophers that sort of built the groundwork for modern states and societies. Well, again, you see this veneer theory. Again, the notion that in the state of nature, if people are just free to roam around, we are engaging in a war of all against all. And it's only, the security that the rulers give us in a more hierarchical society that establishes this peace. So the idea of veneer theory, it comes back again and again and again and again. It's so deeply embedded in our culture. It's also, I think, at the heart of capitalism, the notion that people are just selfish. And this had to be a pretty big book because I believe that it's fundamentally wrong, that veneer theory is contradicted by the latest evidence we have from anthropology, from archaeology, from psychology, and from sociology, you name it. And that the implications of that are really profound, because what you assume in other people is what you get out of them. If you believe veneer theory is true, then you will build a pretty hierarchical, bureaucratic political system. If you believe that humans have evolved to cooperate and that most people deep down are pretty decent, you could move to a much more egalitarian and democratic society.
Yeah. No, so I think that, look, I think it's a very important idea. And I think your book pretty much demolishes it. The one thing I want to pause on, because it was sort of the big disagreement I had with your book, and so I wanted to just flesh it out. And you just referred to it, is your use of Hobbes and Rousseau. I think that and just give me a little bit of time because I want to spell this out. Sure. But I think that there is a caricature of Hobbes and Rousseau that goes back to Diderot and his account of them in the Encyclopedia, where he says Hobbes believes that men are essentially fearful, and Rousseau believes that they're good. And in fact, Diderot says these are two extremes, and both are wrong. But if we take Hobbes first, it is true that you quote the famous line of the Leviathan about the war of all against all. But if you take all of Hobbes, if you also look at his books, De Cive and the Elements of Law, his picture is much more complex. I mean, he thinks, effectively, he says, it's not that all men are evil, or that all men are fearful. But if some men are evil, and there is no society, organizing principle to society, men will eventually become fearful. And the other, I think, really important point is he isn't a believer in hierarchy. He's actually a radical egalitarian. In fact, he thinks that one of the sources of conflict is inequality and the desire for some people to dominate over others. So when we create, and we create, the ruler doesn't take over us. We appoint this ruler. It might be a parliament, it might be a king, depending on which book of Hobbes you read. The idea is that this person is going to, below this ruler, society is going to be radically egalitarian. And it's more an argument, in that sense, it anticipates more Leninism than it does a kind of conservative. He's not a believer in aristocracy and social hierarchies in that sense. The contrast with Rousseau, I think the important point here is that Rousseau's state of nature and Hobbes' state of nature are apples and oranges. Because in Hobbes' state of nature, we are social. In Rousseau's state of nature, we're pre-social. We're in the forest, hanging out as much with nature as we are with other humans. And it's when we start hanging out with other humans that the problems start, because egos get in the way, the desire for dominance gets in the way. And finally, if you look at Rousseau when he writes A Social Contract, he starts to look a lot more like Hobbes, because he believes that we can, we do need to, well, as he says at the start of Social Contract, if you take men as they are, not as they might be, this is what you need to do. I just want to say one last thing about this, which is the way I read it. I think on one level, Hobbes and Rousseau are both your guys, because they are believers in politics. They're believers that people can actually enact radical political change through democratic means. The world can look very different. And they're also both radical egalitarians. And on another level, they're both not your guy, because the enemy for them is the same, which is participatory or deliberative democracy. That's what they don't like. They're believers in majority rule, consensus, and then we all just accept the consensus and go. To take a contemporary example, I think certainly both Hobbes and Rousseau I think their theories would be consistent with saying 52% of people in Britain voted for Brexit. We all just need to accept Brexit and move on. So why I say all this is, I think you can be like me and agree with all the conclusions of your book, but still feel like it doesn't need to rest on the caricature of Hobbes and Rousseau, that it maybe doesn't fully reflect the real picture.
Yeah. Well, look, you're probably 100% right. It's one of the ironies of intellectual history, isn't it? Is that obviously many of these great thinkers are so much more nuanced and complex, and sometimes they contradict each other, in many themselves in many of their writings, right? You can't believe all of it. I sometimes wonder about that myself in my own work. So obviously Humankind is often described as a really optimistic book about, our inherent friendliness, etc. And probably, for a long time, whenever people talk about my work, they'll say, oh, Rutger, the guy who believes humans are good, are naturally good, or something like that, which I don't believe at all, actually. I think there's a big difference between friendliness and being actually good. And you could also argue that this friendliness is exactly the problem. I mean, where does progress come from? It often comes from people who are a pain in the ass to other people, who are willing to make other people uncomfortable, and who are radicals, or are at least willing to be unrealistic, and are not being afraid of being expelled and cast out of the group. So I don't know. I can see that in my own work. And sometimes you think like, oh, if someone would make sort of the short caricature version of my work, then. But another way, I mean, I try to set it up in the book in that way. I try to sort of show that, at least in intellectual history, it's this eternal debate about, is it the Rousseauian view or is it the Hobbesian view? But I mean, I completely get your point. If the proper intellectual historians study the work, that there's obviously something else going on in the text.
That view of them has been very influential. That view of the idea that there's a Hobbes camp and
exactly.
Yeah. I think how I see your work across the two books is that you see optimism as, you want to redefine optimism as a kind of realism, in the sense that you think we shouldn't lose sight of what is actually possible, good and bad. And politics should be about, this idea of politics as the art of the possible shouldn't be, just compromise and just, narrow your horizons, but actually think, no, a huge number of things are possible. Yes. And so I think both in Utopia for Realists and in Humankind, you keep coming back to that, that idea. So before we open up to questions from the audience, just a couple of final quick ones from me. So, towards the end of Humankind, you have your 10 rules, and one of them is, rule number 8 is, don't read the news. And I wanted to bring this up because, I wanted to ask you to talk a bit about The Correspondent, which is, a publication with no news, no news, no advertising, and no cynicism.
Yes. So it's a journalism platform that was founded 8 years ago here in the Netherlands, and that really made my career possible. I wrote this whole book on the platform. And the philosophy from the beginning has been that we do not write about the news because we think that the news is bad for you. It's bad for society. It's bad for democracy. And we define the news as the relentless reporting on stuff that happens today, the sensational stuff. It's usually negative, crime, corruption, political scandal, blah, blah, blah. All the stuff that, is breaking news here, update there, that makes us scrolling our news feeds. And it's pretty addictive as well. We've known for a very long time that the news is not good for you mentally. Psychologists describe it as the mean world syndrome. People who are really addicted to the news, they become more cynical, they become more depressed. And actually, if you test them on simple questions about the state of the world, the news makes you, it doesn't just not inform you, actually misinforms you. So people become, have a less realistic view. A lot of people who watch a lot of the news believe that extreme poverty has gone up in the last decades. They believe that crime has gone up in the last few decades. They believe that, diseases, that in many ways, the world is becoming a worse place. Obviously, that's not the case. If we look at, just the neutral statistics, I mean, it's pretty easy to make the case that we're actually making some progress. So what we try to do is to do a kind of journalism that actually helps you to understand the world and also makes you want to be part of solutions. It's sometimes called constructive journalism. It's not the same as just the positive news, right? Oh, there's another panda that was born in the zoo yesterday and we should all be happy about it. I mean, that's not very serious. No, it's actually a lot about the structural problems of our time, whether it's climate change or the extinction of species or you name it. But we also try to focus on the people who are actually already coming up with solutions, and to see where we could go from here. So yeah, that's sort of the kind of journalism we've been practicing. Indeed, it's important that we do it without ads. It's entirely member funded, because I think that advertising is also pretty pernicious for us in the news industry. You know, it pushes you towards clickbait and to focus on certain kind of subjects that everyone is already talking about. And now one of the most important things you can do as a journalist is to change the subject, right? Because, I mean, let's be honest, most people talk about the same things all the time. I mean, now in the world of opinion, at least in America and the UK, a lot of people are obsessed with things like cancel culture, for example. And I'm not saying that cancel culture isn't real or it's not a problem, but I'm pretty sure that the historians of the future will not consider it one of the main challenges that people face at the beginning of the 21st century, right? It's relatively unimportant. So what is much more important? Well, for example, the risk of synthetic biology, that we are now developing viruses in the labs, or at least we develop technologies where scientists could just artificially create a virus that is as contagious as the flu, as deadly as Ebola, and has an incubation time of HIV. I mean, that would be the most monstrous disease ever to be on Earth, and we could possibly create it. And actually, the costs of that are going down, 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 down. Well, no one's writing about that. That seems incredibly worrying. So we at the Correspondent would when we would read about something like that, we'd be like, okay, we want to have a journalist on that full time. That would be sort of our approach. And I think it's been pretty wonderful. You know, it has enabled me to write this book about the last 200,000-300,000 years of human history. And I think a lot more of our journalism should look like that. You should try and write a newspaper or make a newspaper that people will still want to read a year or 10 years or even 100 years from now, because then the information in the newspaper will be really valuable.
Okay, I think with that, we'll open up for questions from the audience. Who wants to go first?
Hi. So I wanted to know, in this innate goodness of human nature that you sort of espouse and believe in, did you undertake any social experiment, or do you consider any social experiment on, say, a set of people or a group of people to kind of enhance your theories?
A big part of the book is about social experiments that have been conducted in the past. So what's pretty interesting is that there's some social psychology from the 60s and the 70s that is still hugely influential today, that you can still find in all the textbooks. So people may have heard of something like the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was this small experiment that was done in the 70s. Yeah, you know it?
It was the Stanford Prison Experiment was actually suspect, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So that's why I write one of the chapters about it. Is for people who don't know it, it was an experiment conducted in the 70s by Philip Zimbardo, who's still one of the most famous psychologists alive today. And what he did is he brought 24 students in a fake prison in the basement of Stanford University. 12 of them were the guards, 12 of them were the prisoners. And the story that we're always told about what happened is that very quickly these guards turn into monsters, right? The veneer of their civilization turned out to be very thin, and they started, engaging in the most horrible kind of behavior, very sadistic, very nasty. And it became hugely famous. There's documentaries about it that you can watch, on Netflix still today. Philip Zimbardo became hugely famous. It's still in all the textbooks. It's like an irresistible story. It's sort of like reality television before reality television even existed. Now, in the book, I show that actually the Stanford Prison Experiment is a hoax. These students who were supposedly so monstrous were specifically instructed by Philip Zimbardo and his research assistant to be as horrible as possible, because they needed these results to go to the press and say, look, prisons are horrible environments. We got to reform the whole thing. And what they later did, it's a funny story, is that the BBC thought, well, let's do this again, but let's do it for television, because, you know, everyone loves the Stanford Prison Experiment. You know, it's such a horrific experiment. Let's do it again for television. It will be great for ratings. And so they found 2 British psychologists who agreed to cooperate. But the psychologist said, we'll do the experiment again, but on the condition that we do not interfere, right? So we're not going to push these guards or prisoners in any direction. We're just going to put them into prison and just watch what happens. And the BBC made a huge mistake at the time. They said, okay, let's do it that way. So they didn't interfere. Now, for you and for all my other readers, I took the time to watch this whole show, you know, to watch the, 5 or 6 episodes. I'll never get that time back. You know, it's been the most boring thing I've ever witnessed because already in the first episode, you know, one of the guards says to one of the prisoners, can't we just be friends? You know, can't we just talk about this? And then in the last episode, they're all sitting together in this prison. You know, they're drinking tea together and they're having a good time playing cards, playing a bit of guitar, etc. So the real prison experiment tells us a very disturbing truth about human nature, which is that if you leave people alone, they create some kind of boring, pacifistic commune, which is, of course, not very good for television ratings. So, I mean, this is obviously just one example, but it's been very interesting to see how some of these super famous psychological findings from the 1960s that were considered very disturbing by many people have been debunked in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Next question.
Or acknowledgement. I had this book gifted to me by my daughter, the elder one, and the younger one is studying psychology. So when I read the book and I reached to this Stanford Experiment thing, and that's her Bible, and she's been taught about the bad part of human nature, so to speak. I said, hey, look, I didn't have an argument. Instinctively, I said there's something wrong because my lived experience is not confirming that all human beings are negative and, you know, that collaboration is not possible. But
yes,
deep conditioning in school. I mean, she's at 12th grade and she wanted to study more about psychology. So I want to just put that on the table. That look, it's a fascinating work that you've done, and thank you very much. I have nothing else to ask you. I just said, please keep doing the good stuff, and happy to support and understand you better. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. And yeah, I can't agree more. Our schooling systems are really, really important in this case. It's also the way we educate our kids. I used to believe that it was just the only way to do it, right? To have these relatively hierarchical systems where there's a curriculum and, you know, the teachers say, well, this is the kind of knowledge that you need to learn about. I've got one chapter in the book about a very different kind of school here in the Netherlands, but there are many, you know, similar schools around the globe where they do things very differently. You know, they've abolished homework. They've abolished classes. They put all kids together from different ages and different, you know, levels and backgrounds, etc. And then they can follow their own curiosity. It's a little bit like an anarchistic commune. I went there expecting that, you know, I'll be honest, I was very, very skeptical. But it's another example is that once you assume something else in other people, if you assume that kids are naturally curious and creative, you can build a completely different kind of educational system. I don't think we should be too dogmatic about it, right? So don't think in blueprints like, oh, this works here, let's implement it there. But we can gradually experiment and maybe move to different kind of systems.
Yeah, next question.
Hi, Rutger. I've been a big fan of your first book, Utopia for Realists, but haven't gone around to Humankind. Okay. My question is, with the increasing sort of private space race which is going on, right, with billionaires starting to have colonies on Mars, like I just want to pick your brain on your thoughts about the philosophy going around that humans were born on Earth, but they're not supposed to end here. We are supposed to explore other planets and other parts of the universe. So just wanted to have your thoughts on that.
I think it's a little bit sad that now when we think about space we mainly think about narcissistic billionaires. Right? It used to be very different. It's sort of sad that it's also when we think about technology, is that technology has become something that makes a lot of people pessimistic. You know, when I say technology, a lot of people think big tech, or they think Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg, or they think surveillance, right? And this is really a problem with progressives today, and a lot of people on the left, is that they don't have a positive vision anymore of where technology could take us. Technology is not some kind of external force. It's not a force of nature. It's not a force of history. It's not something that happens to us. It's something that we create. And I think what progressives today really lack is basically a philosophy of technology, of what kind of technologies we want and where we want to go. And so in my view, I mean, I think rockets are pretty awesome. And I think spaceships are pretty awesome. And I love Star Wars and Star Trek, etc. And yes, I want to get to Mars. I want to build a colony there. I'm just pretty sad that the only way we can envision it today is that it's being done by narcissistic billionaires, right? It wasn't always like that. I mean, the space race obviously happened in the context of the Cold War, but it was obviously a whole society, a government that mobilized to do something like that. So I don't know. It's just a general point about that I think it's sad that whenever we think about technology, we sort of become cynical and we don't really have a positive vision of where it could take us. And I think that should really change.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that quickly, because would you also say that part of the fault comes in a media that is more focused on celebrating the billionaires' space adventures than, say, examining their tax avoidance?
Yes. It's actually interesting. You know, there's a wonderful book written by an Italian economist. Her name is Mariana Mazzucato. And the book is called The Entrepreneurial State. And what she tries to show in the book is that a lot of the really important inventions of the last couple of decades were actually financed by the state. I mean, Elon Musk is a good example. I think he received around $5.5 billion in government subsidies. And now he goes on television to say how the government is so horrible, right? That's usually how these guys operate. So Mazzucato has one chapter in her book about the iPhone, and she shows that every sliver of important technology in the iPhone that makes it a smartphone instead of a stupid phone was actually invented by researchers on the government payroll. So whether it's the battery technology or the internet or the voice recognition software or the touchscreen technology, all of that came out of publicly funded research. It's just a story that people don't hear, right? We only hear about the Steve Jobses and the Elon Musks, etc. And I don't want to be dogmatic here. I'm actually a pretty big fan of people like Elon Musk in many respects. I mean, he's made electric cars masculine, which I think is an enormous gift to the environmental movement. So I don't want to be too dogmatic here, but we also shouldn't lose sight of what publicly funded research can do. And it's actually when things work together, right? When you have the great researchers that are mostly publicly funded come up with the breakthrough inventions. And then, there are creative companies like, for example, Apple, who are good at design and make a nice product out of it. Sure, that's fine, as long as they pay their taxes, right? So that we can fund the next round of innovation. That's why, I've been giving some attention to the issue of tax avoidance and tax evasion, because that's obviously extremely hypocritical to take all that research, to build on something that's been financed by other people, and then avoid your taxes.
Any more questions?
Yeah, we have 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Hello, Rutger. I hope I got your name right. My name is Anuradha. I'm the co-founder of India's largest solutions-based constructive journalism platform called The Better India.
Terrific.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So we reach out to over 200 million people with our stories of change every month. But I wanted to connect with you today because you and I have so much in common. I think we start from the same premise that humankind is hopeful. I mean, there is progress. People want to connect and do good things together. My question is, and something that I still fail to understand, why is our education system, our journalism schools, everything not catering to this need, right? To this understanding of human nature, that people want to connect. Like you mentioned, the BBC documentary, which obviously did not do very well because it did not cover the voyeuristic or those elements which make for great TRP. Why are we not taking these learnings and incorporating them in our own lives?
It's a really good question. So you could connect this to one of the fundamental questions I had to ask when I was writing this book is, if people really aren't fundamentally selfish, then why do we so often believe it, right? Why does the idea come back again and again? And it's because of the kind of information that we get from the news. It's because, this deeply embedded veneer theory that's so influential in our culture. It's also because it's in the interest of those at the top for us to be cynical. Because if we can trust each other, then we need CEOs and presidents and kings and queens, etc. Right? So cynicism is a ruling ideology, and it's been for a very long time. But maybe most fundamentally, it's also something within ourselves. Psychologists call it the negativity bias, is that we humans focus much more on the negative than on the positive, right? I mean, we all experience this in our careers. We need around, 100 compliments to counter one piece of criticism, right? And there's probably some evolutionary reason for this. If we wanted to survive in a tough environment like the jungle, for example, I mean, it helped us to survive, to be afraid of spiders and snakes, right? And you'd rather be afraid once too often than not afraid at the crucial moment. But today, when we're being bombarded by bad stuff, especially from the news industry, the negativity bias has gone berserk, and it's hard to counter that. The news is a little bit like a drugs, right? There's this one guy who describes it as sugar for the mind. We know it's not good for us, but it's very hard to resist it. And to be honest, I think that is something that constructive journalists will always have to struggle with, because there's part of us that, understands this and really wants to read, the healthy stuff, the healthy journalism. But yeah, then there's another part of our brain that just wants the sugar.
Okay, final question.
Very quickly, one last.
I just want to ask you, why is this resurgence of radical religion today? Is it something to worry about? All the three, Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism. Does it worry you, or is it just a blip?
To be honest, it's not really my expertise, so I don't really know. Maybe as a historian, I would be a little bit skeptical when people say that, things are worse than ever. It's a little bit similar with the technology debate. People sometimes ask me, right, oh, but there's so much polarization and there's so much distrust being spread around and blah, blah, blah. And then my inclination as a historian is to say, well, look, Hitler didn't have a Facebook account, right? And he still managed to do a lot of damage. There's something called chronocentrism, a concept that historians use to describe the phenomenon where people think that their own time is so special, that things have never happened before. But actually, that's another reason why I think history is so exciting, because you won't encounter exactly the same phenomena, but you'll learn a lot by studying from history, and you also realize that in many ways we've been there before. So in that way, we could learn from the past. Again,
the book is Humankind, Hopeful History, available, I know for a fact, in all bookshops, certainly in Bangalore. And it's really, I think it's too simple to call it optimistic, but it's a very refreshing take on, I think, both human history and human nature. So hopefully everybody who hasn't read it yet goes out and reads it. Thank you, Rutger.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.